Hi guys! Today we're going to be learning how to make this basic crochet winter cardigan. It's super easy, especially if you're a beginner, but it can also work for people who are more advanced. The materials and pattern are located in the description box. I wanted to give a basic overview of the components of the cardigan, just to emphasize that this cardigan is not one size fit all. So you can actually add or lessen the amount of rows that you complete to fit you or someone else's body. The cardigan is made up of 3 components: the body, the left arm, and the right arm. We're going to begin with the body since it is the bulk of the work. As you can probably tell, the body is made up of a series of increases and decreases. So to make it easier to explain, we're just going to divide it into 3 parts. We're going to start off with part 1, which includes our foundation chain. This work is worked horizontally, so in the end you're actually going to flip it to wear it. So we're going to start off with our slip knot. To make a slip knot, you're simply going to wrap your yarn around 2 fingers. Then you're going to pull your yarn through that loop that you just created to create yet again another loop. Once you've created that loop, you're just going to pull tight and fasten it so that it fits snug around your crochet hook. The next thing you're going to do is chain the distance from the top of your shoulder to the bottom of your knee. Now note, this can be different for everyone, so whether you have to chain more or less, it does not matter, but chain the amount from the top of your shoulder to about the bottom of your knee. The more you chain, the longer your cardigan. I decided to chain 100. Since we're working both sides of the cardigan at once, you're going to double the amount of chains that you previously chained. So I'm going to chain 100 more for a total of 200 chains. Next, you're going to add 1 chain, and this is just going to count as our turning chain. When you've completed your foundation chain, it's time to move on to row 1. For row 1, we're going to half double crochet in the second chain from the hook and every chain across. You should have the same amount of half double crochet as you did in your foundation chain. So, I had 200 foundation chains total, excluding the add 1 chain, so I'm going to have 200 half double crochets total for my first row. So we're going to continue on by just skipping that first chain, because that's our turning chain, and we're going to yarn over. We're going to insert our hook into the next chain. We're going to pull through so that we have 3 loops on our hook, and then we're going to yarn over and we're going to pull through all 3 loops on the hook. And that completes our first half double crochet. You're going to continue on until you reach the end of your chain. Next, you're going to chain 1 and turn. As I mentioned prior, this pattern is very flexible, so it can be adjusted for numerous shapes and sizes. As a general rule of thumb, the number of rows completed in part 1 is equal to the distance from the outside of your shoulder to the beginning of your neck. And I just want to emphasize again that this pattern is being worked horizontally, so the number of rows will equate that distance. You can complete as many rows as you feel necessary, but just remember that the more rows you complete, the wider your cardigan. I chose to work my rows for part 1 up to row 15. For these rows, I'm going to half double crochet in the center bar of the second stitch from the hook and every stitch across for a total of 200 half double crochet. So if we were working our stitches normally, we'd work them into these V's that kind of sit on top of the stitch. And for the half double crochet, we'd simply just yarn over and then just insert our hook into that V, right? That's a normal stitch. Well, we're not going to do that, okay? Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to yarn over and we're going to insert our hook into these center bars, and they just sit right below the actual stitch, okay? So I yarned over. I'm just going to insert my hook into this center bar. It's one loop, it's not several loops that we're inserting our hook into. I'm going to pull through so that I have 3 on my hook, and then I'm going to once again yarn over and pull through again to complete my half double crochet. And if you're not familiar with this, this is called a knit stitch, or a variation of making a knit stitch. It's very easy once you get the hang of it, but I suggest just re-watching this if this is your first time doing it, only so you can kind of just understand the concept. What you'll begin to notice is that your stitches are actually flipping over to the other side to create that knit-like look, and this actually makes your piece more dense than, say, working it into normal stitches. When you've completed your row, you're simply going to chain 1 and turn. And once again, I'm going to work my half double crochets into the center bar of every stitch across until I reach the end of the row. Once again, this is just a reminder that I'm working up to row 15, but you can work up to as many rows as you want for part 1, so long as it equates the distance from your shoulder to the beginning of your neck. As you can see, we've begun to create this beautiful fabric. It's very dense, very knit-like, and once you're done with part 1, you are ready to move on to part 2. Part 2 is where we create the decrease to make room for our neck, basically, because we have to have somewhere to put our neck and for the 2 panels in front of us to sit. So we're going to begin by chaining 1 and turning our work. And to create this neck space, we're going to complete half the amount of stitches that we completed in part 1. So for me, that number is 100. For you, it may be 150, it may be 5. Whatever you need to do, we're going to move on to row 16, or whatever your next row is, where I'm just going to half double crochet in the center bar of the second stitch from the hook and the next 99 stitches. And just to simplify that verbiage, it's basically just me half double crocheting in the center bar halfway across my work. When you've completed that first row of part 2, you're going to chain 1 and turn. So in part 2, the number of rows you complete is equal to the width of your neck. So once again, as a reminder, this part is just creating a space for your neck. So it's literally the distance from one side of your neck to the other side of your neck. I completed up to row 23, and for me, this gave me a total of 8 rows. For these rows, we're simply going to half double crochet in the center bar of the second stitch from the hook and every stitch across for a total of 100 stitches. So what's important about part 2 is that you end on a row that ends on the short side of your work, which is denoted by this arrow right here on the screen. You don't want to end on the long side, which is on the left side, because that won't allow you to complete the other half of your cardigan. Once you've completed part 2, you can move on to part 3. Part 3 is essentially an exact replica of part 1. It's a mirror image because we're trying to complete the cardigan at this point. In this, we're basically going to double the amount of stitches that we crocheted in part 2 to equal the amount of stitches that we had in part 1. So I'm going to chain 100 because I want the total amount of stitches in part 3 to equal 200 stitches. When you've completed the amount of chains necessary, you're going to chain 1 and turn your work. So for your next row, you're going to half double crochet in the same chains that you just created. So for me, that's for the second chain from the hook and the next 99 chains for a total of 100 half double crochet. When you reach the point where the actual stitches begin, you're going to half double crochet in the next stitch, and that's in the center bar of the next stitch, and the center bar of every stitch across until you reach the end of the row. You're going to have a total of 200 half double crochet, or the same total that you had in part 1. When you reach the end of the row, you're going to chain 1 and turn. So, the number of rows that you complete in part 3 must be equivalent to the number of rows that you complete in part 1. So I completed 15 rows in part 1, and therefore I'm going to complete 15 rows total in part 3. So for me, that's up to row 38. Now remember, you already created a row for part 3. So in this, I'm actually creating 14 more rows to equal 15 rows total. In all, I created 38 rows for the body of my work. You may have more or less, but in the end, what you're going to do is chain 1, pull up a loop, cut and fasten, and this will complete the body of our work. Next, we're going to move on to the arms, and you're going to make 2 arms. They're made the exact same way. This is also worked horizontally, and we're just going to start off with our slip knot. For the arms, you're going to chain the distance from the top of your shoulder to the bottom of your wrist. I'm going to chain 60. You can chain however many chains that you want, but just keep in mind that the more chains that you complete, the longer your arm will be. Next, we're going to add 1 chain as our turning chain. Moving on to row 1 of our work, where we're going to half double crochet in the second chain from the hook and every chain across for a total of 60 half double crochet total. When you're done, you're just going to chain 1 and turn. So, making the arms are really easy because it uses the same stitch that we used for the body. The number of rows completed is equivalent to the width of your arm. So in the end, your piece for the arm should be able to wrap around your entire arm. You can create as many rows as you want, but the more rows that you create, the wider your sleeve is going to be. I decided to create 22 rows. And for these 22 rows, what I did was half double crochet in the center bar of the second stitch from the hook and every stitch across for a total of 60 half double crochet. Once again, you're going to chain 1 and turn after completing your second row. And you're simply going to repeat row 2 until you reach the desired amount of rows that you want for your arms. When you've completed the desired amount of rows for your arms, you're going to chain 1, then you're going to pull up a super long loop. It does not have to be 20 inches, but it does have to be long enough for you to sew the arm together. And then you're just going to cut and fasten to secure your work. Up next, we're going to sew it all together, and I thought long and hard about how I wanted to demonstrate this, and quite frankly, my viewfinder didn't allow enough space to show the entirety of my work, so I figured that I would give you guys graphics just to make the visual a little bit more understanding and comprehensive. Now, when I say sewing, I simply mean just weaving the pieces together in a secure fashion. Honestly, I do this differently every single time, but the goal is just to make sure that your piece is actually put together properly in the sense that it won't fall off, you won't have an arm falling off while you're walking through the mall, something like that, you know? So however you need to secure your piece, do so in a way that is reasonable to you. But in terms of the actual sewing, it's not a specific stitch, it's not anything fancy. Generally, what I like to do is just weave the pieces together. You're always going to start by attaching a piece of yarn to your sewing needle, preferably a long piece of yarn. If you already have a long piece of yarn attached to the actual piece, you can just use that for your sewing. We're going to begin by folding our arm in half, or arms, because you do have to do 2, and we're just going to do so in a hot dog style, the same way that it would wrap around your arm. And you're going to sew along the open end of the arm parallel to the folded end so that it creates a little tube for your arm to go into. The parts where I sew in this demonstration are best shown through the yellow highlight. So anywhere that I choose to sew will be shown with a yellow highlight over it. Of course, you're going to repeat the same sewing procedure with the second arm. Once you've completed the arms, we're going to move on to the body. And for the body, we're going to begin by folding the panels of the body over to the other side. So we're basically folding it in half. On one side, you're going to have the complete side, which is the back side of our cardigan. And on the other side, which should be the side facing upward, you're going to have the 2 panels that will be the panels that kind of fall below or above the front of your body to create the front of the cardigan. Before we begin sewing the actual body together, we're going to align the arms with the body so that we know what point we need to sew up to. In sewing the body, we're going to begin by sewing from the bottom, and we're going to move up to the point in which our arms begin. So the point that we actually stop at will leave space for us to sew on our arms. Once you reach the point in which you are ready to sew on the arms, you're going to sew together the circumference of both spaces. So you have the arm that's kind of like a tube, and you see that circle there with the grayish inside? You're going to sew around that yellow, and you're going to sew that to the actual body. So you're going to have 2 open circles that you're basically going to sew around the circumference, because remember, our arm has to go inside the actual space. So you're not sewing both sides of the arm together. Instead, you're sewing around the circumference so that you can create a space in which the body leads to the arm and you can put your arm through to look cute in your cardigan, okay? Of course, you're going to follow the same steps for the second arm. And once you've completed all of your sewing, make sure that you just sew and tie in all of the loose ends because you don't want any loose ends hanging out of your cardigan. Thank you so much for watching and giving me an opportunity to teach you this pattern. I'll see you in my next video. Please subscribe.